Well, hello again, my friends. This is Reverend Susan at St. George Episcopal Church in San Antonio, Texas, bringing another edition of the Introduction to the New Testament class on demand. Today we have 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus for you, so let's get started. 1st Timothy, affirmation of the truth in Christ. So a little bit of overview. 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus are known as pastoral letters. Timothy and Titus were both church leaders, and we'll talk a little more about that. There is some question about Paul's authorship, not by me, by some other scholars. I'm pretty solid in my belief that St. Paul was the one that penned these 3 letters. And they make a lot of scholars make the case that even if Paul didn't literally write it with his own hand, he had influence over what was said in the letters. So I'm not going to get into that argument. It's interesting, but not that important. First Timothy is written as Paul left Timothy in Ephesus. It was probably written around 63 to 67 A.D. Timothy was given primary responsibility for the church in Ephesus, and the letter is advice to Timothy on dealing with false doctrine and matters of church organization and practice. So pretty standard operating procedure type stuff. 1 Timothy 1:3 through 20, heresy and sound doctrine. Sounds fascinating, right? I love heresy. Heresy is awesome. It's really fun to learn about and how the truth gets distorted over time, or not over time, as the case may be. So the false teachers talk about myths and genealogy. They teach the law without understanding. They advocate the ascetic life, like forbidding marriage and certain foods, and they emphasize their brand of knowledge. And so First Timothy doesn't say exactly which heresy they're fighting against. My best guess in reading the chapter and knowing a little bit about heresy is that it was probably a melding of a bunch of different religions and had Gnosticism as its base. And again, if you want to know more about Gnosticism, feel free to shoot me an email. I taught a class on heresy many years ago, but I think I still have my notes. So I'm happy to pass those along. In terms of Gnosticism, it's a pretty fascinating heresy. Anyway, and then Dr. Blair, whose book I'm using to teach this class, all doctrine must pass the standard of the person, Jesus Christ, who has been revealed to us. So basically, the old "what would Jesus do" test. Here you go. Here's where it started. Just kidding. Basically, if you see a doctrine that doesn't sound like something Jesus would say or do, it's probably not legit, right? 1 Timothy 2:1 through 3:13, elements of church organization. So Paul kind of thought that he was about to possibly die, and so he was interested in making sure that the church had a good foundation and a good organizational structure in order to keep the faith, keep knowledge strong, and be committed to Jesus Christ. So matters of worship are discussed, praying and teaching in particular. This has always been a hot topic. The topic of women speaking in churches is discussed here. Women keeping silent contradicts what Paul said in 1 Corinthians that says that women prophesy and pray at church. So what we think, because Paul seems to be completely contradicting himself, is the likelihood for this statement that it is just to this particular church in Ephesus. There was a goddess cult that we know about that may have been infiltrating the church. And what it did was the cult made women superior to men. And Paul's whole thing was there's no longer male nor female, slave nor free, Greek nor Jew nor Gentile, etc. And so it's kind of going the opposite direction from the way it used to go, where men were superior in all things. And this goddess cult made it that women were superior to men in all things. And so Timothy's saying, hey, wait a minute, that's not going to work for us. Or Paul is saying that to Timothy. The letter also discusses bishops, deacons, and women. and how they are to live in the community. And then those that are Christians are called to live by the moral commitments of Christ. So basically walk the talk, folks. 1 Timothy 3:14 through 6:19, additional instructions to Timothy as leader. The rest of the letter talks about relationships within the church. It talks again about the false teachers, including their attempts to gain wealth. So we've heard this before, the itinerant preacher type theory, where you have preachers wandering around, standing on boxes, collecting money for, good oratory. Basically the lawyers of the first century, maybe. I don't know. Just kidding. And then we have the famous "fight the good fight of faith" verse. There's a warning about riches, and Timothy is once again encouraged to remain faithful. And then the letter ends with a short benediction. It's an interesting read. First, Second Timothy have always been my favorite letters. Mostly because I am a young minister, and so reading these words, thinking about, this could be my mentor writing this letter to me, and it still holds the test of time. It's the same problems are happening. So they didn't have COVID back then, but we got pretty much everything else. So 2 Timothy, faithfulness to Christ. Paul is once again in prison, possibly in Rome. The most likely date of this letter, once again, it's going to be for the same for all three of them, is between 63 and 67. And this is actually written after Titus. So there's 1 Timothy, Titus, and then 2 Timothy. We'll talk more about that, not much, but that's the letters. An outline of 2 Timothy. We've got the salutation. We've got a personal charge to Timothy, a charge for correct teaching and practice, and then personal requests of Paul. So the salutation is pretty much the same as 1 Timothy, and that's kind of why it's funny to me that people think Paul didn't write all three letters when all three letters are kind of the same. So anyway, my little beef with scholarship. Paul is an apostle according to the promise of life that is in Christ Jesus. So he says that at the introduction. And this is interesting because he's talking about a promise of life. Death will not have victory. So we're pretty sure he was facing his execution. The statement could point to the fact that Paul thought he was going to be put to death soon. That Christ will have the final say. A personal charge to Timothy. This is great for anyone, but God did not give us a spirit of timidity, but a spirit of power, of love, and self-discipline. Encouraging words for a young pastor. If you ever see a young minister struggling, tell them to go reread 2 Timothy. The words are there, the power is there, the spirit is there. So, just FYI. A charge for correct teaching and practice. Paul charges Timothy to keep in mind his life's impact on others. In other words, Timothy, I don't think Timothy was necessarily doing anything wrong, but Paul is encouraging him to walk the talk, basically, because through Timothy's ministry, people will come to know Jesus Christ. And Paul is basically passing on the torch of responsibility. Again, this could be with his coming possible execution in mind. Personal requests of Paul. This once again it just tells me that Paul wrote this letter. He wanted Timothy to come see him before he was executed. He wanted to see Mark before he was executed, and he wanted his cloak. Like, why would somebody else write that? Anyway. The letter closes with greetings and a benediction and the last recorded words of St. Paul that we have. The Lord be with your spirit. Grace be with you. Titus. Titus is a quick letter. Again, Paul wrote Titus before 2 Timothy sometime, again between 63 and 67. Titus was a church leader in Crete. He was a Gentile and a co-worker of Paul. The instructions are general enough to be read to the whole church. That's why we have the letter. Titus was to put in order what remained to be done. There was a lot of competition in Crete. They think, based on what we know, there were probably more Judaizers who were trying to get people to be Jewish before they became Christian. And Paul, once again, is fighting against that as the apostle to the Gentiles. So chapter 1 has standards for elders and bishops. Chapter 2 has basic instructions for the church. Chapter 3 talks about the church's relationships to challenges from the world around them. And then the letter encourages Titus to live an exemplary life and closes with a meeting request, instructions, and final greetings. So when we put these three letters together, they're just basically really good words to the church in general, good words to leadership. So if you ever want to know what the standards of leadership are in Paul's mind, read these three letters. And I encourage you to read them anyway. If you read 1st and 2nd Timothy, you'll probably read a lot of stuff. You go, oh, that's where that is in the Bible. The prayer book has a lot of the Bible in it. Good old Kramer. So anyway, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email me, sburnham@stgeorgechurch.org. And I'm happy to chat with you. Thanks again for joining me. Bye-bye.